Everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Isabel Holland Lolowitz, and I'll be the moderator this evening. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, but first we'll take care of some business. Please remain muted with video off throughout the lecture. You can submit questions at any time during the lecture using the Zoom chat feature. The speaker will answer questions after the lecture as time allows. The contents of this presentation reflect the views of our speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, the Prairie Research Institute, the University of Illinois, or our sponsoring agencies. As I said earlier, my name is Isabel, and I'm a research archaeologist with the American Bottom Field Station at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. The survey, also referred to as ISAS, is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. With about 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working throughout the state, we are one of the largest archaeological research institutions in the U.S. Part of our mission is the dissemination of archaeological knowledge about the past to our peers and especially to the public. In that spirit, we have offered a series of webinars to highlight our research. Today, we're pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tamira Brennan. Tamira joined ISAS as a section head of curation last August, having previously served as the curator for the Center of Archaeological Investigations at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and the coordinator of ISAS's American Bottom Field Station prior to that. She's been doing archaeology in Illinois for over 2 decades and specializes in the late prehistory of Southeast Missouri and Southern Illinois, ceramic analysis, and collections management. She received her PhD from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, and currently serves on the boards of the Illinois State Museum and the Illinois Archaeological Survey. I'm going to now read a land acknowledgement. I would like to recognize that the university and ISAS are located on the ancestral homelands of several tribes. We recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Chickasaw, and other nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamira Brennan.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Isabel, and for the land acknowledgement. And thank you, everybody, for joining me here today. I'm really pleased to be here to discuss the histories of the indigenous communities that lived throughout the Mid-South during the several centuries prior to European intrusion, as we interpret them through archaeological data. More specifically, today I'm going to be discussing a region that borders the Mississippi and Ohio rivers within Southeast Missouri and southernmost Illinois during the Mississippian period. I'll be referring to this as Southern Illinois throughout the talk for simplicity, despite the fact that it encompasses a larger area. My goal in this talk is to illustrate how the pre-Columbian city of Cahokia, together with the rest of Southern Illinois, composed a very particular physical and social landscape during the Mississippian period, and to emphasize that understanding one illuminates the other. In my future research, I hope to fill gaps in the foundational knowledge on the Mississippian period in this area, so that regional synthesis that considers both Greater Cahokia and everything south is possible. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Mississippian period and what are referred to as Middle Mississippian cultures, it began as early as AD 1050 and ended by the 17th century as the effects of European contact forever altered the demographics of the continent. Mississippian cultures were not a single or uniform group of people, but many diverse communities residing across a large portion of the eastern woodlands, who shared a suite of subsistence practices, many beliefs, and who participated in a wide network that facilitated the exchange of people, ideas, and things. And you can see in this image, Middle Mississippian is the middle of the map. And a lot of these other groups you see on the map are also considered Mississippian, but they have a sort of a different shared suite of characteristics. Middle Mississippians are perhaps most well known for the large earthen mounds they built, and for being the first farmers in the eastern woodlands, among other things. And you've likely heard of the grandest of all Mississippian centers, the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Cahokia, located right here in Illinois, just east of modern-day St. Louis. We know a great deal about the history of Greater Cahokia, an area that includes a vast network of sites, including and surrounding the Cahokia site itself. And we know these things thanks to many large-scale federally funded excavations, urban development, and academic research projects. St. Louis today is a populous place, just as it was a long time ago. So there's been a lot of roads, bridges, housing complexes that have triggered a process that leads to excavation. We know a lot less about the Mississippian period elsewhere in Southern Illinois, and the depth of that knowledge varies widely across the region. It's particularly sparse in rural locations where research has largely been driven only by interest and opportunity and not necessarily by federal dollars, which would be any transportation project. This data variability can be an obstacle to the type of large-scale research that I hope to accomplish, as the types of questions that can be addressed differ starkly between the subregions. Some of the foundational questions about life in the data-poor areas have yet to be addressed, and so a first step in my own research is to help build up that basic understanding. So today I'll be talking about some of what is known about sites in these data-poor areas, as well as preliminary findings from my own recent research, followed by how those data can enhance or are better understood by what is known of Greater Cahokia's rise and decline. I'll begin at Kincaid, which is located along the lower Ohio River within the floodplain across from modern-day Paducah, Kentucky. The region in which Kincaid is situated, the Black Bottoms, is one of the most well-researched areas in Southern Illinois outside of Greater Cahokia. At Kincaid, several grant-funded and university-sponsored projects have tackled the late prehistoric occupation of the area, as well as earlier woodland occupations as well. The reason that this area has received attention is because Kincaid is one of the largest Mississippian period mound centers in existence, and were it not for the presence of Cahokia so relatively near, it would probably be more well-known within Illinois. It's also in a very rural location, so that contributes to the fact that it's not as well-known as Cahokia. This site received a decade of attention by the University of Chicago and later the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s to 40s. The University of Chicago was at the time the leader in North American archaeological research and field methods, and their alumni went on to conduct some of the most extensive and important research throughout the United States. Those Chicago excavations were halted at the onset of World War II, and the results were not published until 1951. There's still a great deal to learn from the collections and field notes that those excavations generated, because they didn't receive the attention intended for them due to the loss of labor and funds that the war presented. We know something about the many sites surrounding Kincaid thanks to research at Southern Illinois University Carbondale in the 1970s and 80s under the direction of John Muller. And he studied the sites in the bottom and in the uplands surrounding Kincaid, not necessarily Kincaid itself. We've learned much more about the community organization population and the domestic aspects of the site thanks to a second wave of SIU and Center for Archaeological Research beginning in the 2000s, which includes my own. That most recent research was guided by a large-scale geophysical survey that made the locations and density of many houses apparent. And this research was published by Butler and his colleagues in 2011 in an issue of SEAC. You can see in this slide the coverage, everything you see in gray, and this really is a phenomenal and large-scale survey. The area that's largely white on the eastern side of the site is not covered, in part because it's wooded and also because that portion of the site is in private ownership, whereas the western 2/3 are owned by the state of Illinois. And I know that you probably can't see at the scale that you're seeing this slide here, all of the magnetic anomalies in this survey, which they kind of look like little black dots. But here I've highlighted one area and the black dots that we've interpreted as houses. And we've tested some of these with excavations and proven they are in fact houses. This was really significant, not only because it allows us to do non-invasive study of the site, but it also guides us to do more effective research later on. And the area that I've highlighted was an area that we previously thought had no features because it was buried under very thick flood deposits. So this technology has really allowed us to update our interpretation of the site. From all of this, we understand that Kincaid has about 31 mounds, give or take. Doctors Butler and Welch are still doing research out at the site, coring through some of the proposed mounds to see whether or not they're actually mounds or natural ridges. And Kincaid begins somewhere between AD 1050 and 1100, and it's occupied continuously until AD 1450. A dozen of these mounds are large platform mounds that held temples and communal buildings, most of which are arranged around two separate plazas or open spaces surrounded by mounds. One of these is located centrally, kind of in the middle of the image you're seeing there, and one less certain plaza at the eastern edge of the site where the second large mound group is. A final platform mound stands alone at the western limits of the site, and these altogether cover nearly 70 hectares. You can see from the brown line that Kincaid was palisaded. We've tested several locations. We're not certain if the palisade was along the lakefront or not. It's kind of a topic of debate. And the palisade encompassed the entire site at one point and then retracted to cover only a smaller portion of the site later in its history. So the largest palisade enclosure was during the middle Kincaid period. Kincaid's divided into early, middle, and late phases. And this is about 1200 AD when its sprawling growth included West Mound, which you see circled here. And this area included probable immigrants to the site. And we think that because there's disparities in the artifacts and in the styles of the houses between this West Mound area and the rest of the site. By the latest period, this is the approximate site boundaries, that West Mound area was abandoned. At this time, the site also becomes the most complex. Pottery becomes more uniform across village areas, and large buildings atop the second largest mound and in the plaza show that there was a place for communal gatherings, while a very small building at the apex of the largest mound on site suggests an elite residence. The very latest dates we have for Kincaid place its end near AD 1450, which marks the near abandonment of a region referred to as the Vacant Quarter. This Vacant Quarter encompasses Cahokia, southeast Missouri, southwest Indiana, and the Tennessee Cumberland drainage. Mississippian life outside of this region continues until and through European contact. So together, these data paint a picture of a site that probably begins slightly later than Cahokia and starts very small, but ends as the largest mound site in the region, a century after Cahokia was largely abandoned. Elsewhere in southern Illinois, small habitation sites, ritual centers, and small to moderate mound groups all appear in locations previously unoccupied or sparsely occupied, beginning in the 13th century. Few of these outside of Kincaid have been studied in any depth, and a tighter chronology is needed to really get at the dynamics of life in southern Illinois. But it's clear that the region becomes more active and is likely more populous post AD 1200. A site that I'm using to further examine the dynamics of the region is South Cape, a large village and probable regional center a mile from the Mississippi River in southeast Missouri. South Cape begins much later than Kincaid. All 5 of the credible radiocarbon dates available as of last year were run on excavations from the central portion of the site, and they tightly center at about AD 1350. This site is advantageously located at the interstice of several ecotones, so its residents had access to diverse resources, from the river, from wetlands, from forests, and we see that reflected in the faunal assemblage. This site was excavated for several field school seasons by Duncan Wilkie through Southeast Missouri State University in the late 70s and 80s, then again for 4 seasons in the mid-2000s under my direction. Most recently, Dr. Jennifer Bankston has taught several additional field schools, again through SEMO. Wilkie's excavations are highlighted in blue here, and their size and location are approximate, since complete field notes and maps and the original datum that he used have not been located. He identified within his excavations a special area with a women's house, a potential cemetery, and a midden area, and the more recent excavations, which you see in yellow, located a habitation area, special use buildings, a post pit, and a possible plaza. Artifacts recovered between these 2 digs indicate that South Cape's people had access to elite goods, they participated in long-distance trade, and their architecture included special use buildings. What you see on the top left of the screen was an artifact made out of marine shell. It's a Triskel-style shell gorget, and that was found in what Wilkie called the women's house. Within this house were burials of many infants placed underneath turtle carapaces, and the bottle that you see under that gorget was found in the plow zone nearby. It's badly broken because it was hit by the plow, but it very clearly indicates a woman nursing probably a toddler based on the size of that child. In the middle, you can see a piece of cut mica that's very large. Mica comes from, among other places, from the Appalachian Mountains. And in the center, that's a bear's tooth. We found several pieces of bear, black bear, and other exotic fauna as well. And on the upper right, that's a head pot. It's not complete. It would have had a long neck, which has been pretty expertly filed down by whomever recovered that. That was found by a looter on the site and given to the landowner. And it's not necessarily typical of the style of head pots that you see in southeast Arkansas, but it is one of the more northerly ones that we have seen. In March of 2019, I, Dr. Bengston, and staff from ISAS collaborated to begin a geophysical survey of the site to help assess the potential damage of a large and active sinkhole that had developed, among less pressing research objectives. And on the right, you can see a picture of the sinkhole. You could probably park a small bus in there at this point. We covered about 50% of the site in that survey, which yielded really unexpected results. Namely, a second occupation area where excavations from the 70s indicated that only a cemetery existed. And I presume that the skeletons that were found in that cemetery excavation were in the floors of houses, and that the house superpositioning was so thick that the excavators did not realize that they were digging through a house when they found that. We formerly thought before the survey that habitation was confined to the apex of the terrace, where you can also see anomalies representing buildings. And up on the terrace, the magnetic image is less clear as to what we see. But it's now apparent that the second very organized occupation area in the on the eastern side is probably separated by a plaza. So we see magnetic anomalies on the terrace top and on the eastern ridge, but not in between. Here you can see the square outlines of house basins very tightly packed in a grid-like manner. I've put a red dot in the center of some of the most obvious ones, which kind of look like watermarks in this image, in case you're not familiar with what a magnetometry image looks like. There are many more in this image that I have not marked, but you can see they vary in size, they're all approximately square, and they're all oriented in the same direction. Small test excavations in 2020 confirmed that the magnetic anomalies in the eastern site area are indeed houses. A sample from one of these returned a surprisingly late uncalibrated date of 500 BP, which translates somewhere between 1400 and 1450 with a 95% confidence interval. This means the occupation in the East Village could be as late as a century beyond the latest date we've run from atop the terrace. And if you're wondering how we were out in 2020, these excavations actually took place the 3 days before the world shut down for COVID. So happily, the last thing I did was dig in the ground before I had to stay inside for the next year. So more data are needed on the duration of the Eastern Village area to explore the several possibilities about the site's occupation. These possibilities include that there are two village areas occupied at the same time at this site, or that terrace top village area was relocated to the eastern ridge as the apex of the site was repurposed for other uses. If the two contemporaneous village scenario is the case, then South Cape bears resemblance to late Mississippian villages in the Little Black River lowland to the southwest in Missouri, where paired villages are common during the Powers phase from AD 1250 to 1400. And you can see on the lower right, these are two Powers phase paired villages, Turner and Snodgrass, that were excavated, I believe, in the 80s. Preliminary analysis of the ceramics from both Duncan Wilkie's and my excavations at South Cape support the likelihood of this possibility because they reveal similarities with the assemblages of ceramics that come from the southern areas, rather than to ceramic assemblages from contemporaneous sites immediately across the river in Illinois. Further data on the site layouts from those understudied Illinois sites should prove illuminating as to whether or not this sort of thing is happening in Illinois. It may be that South Cape is an example of a northerly outpost for peoples due south. The likelihood of the second scenario, that the apex of the site was repurposed for special use, is also very possible. It's supported by the presence of a phenomenally large building that I interpreted as a palisade wall in my previous excavations due to its length, width, and depth. And it was rebuilt at least 2 times. So there's 3 versions of this building. And you can see in the center there, I'm about halfway down in that excavation, the depth of this wall trench. And to the right of it, one of the rebuilds is singly set posts. So you see a long trench and some kind of circles there. I now believe that this palisade is actually the wall of a very large rectangular structure based on the results of the geophysical survey. And you can see a rectangular thing where I have that arrow pointing to the left. That's where this wall is. Other overbuilt architecture adjacent to this building supports the notion of the area as special use. So on the right-hand side, you can see the wall trench of what otherwise appeared to be a regular rectangular building. And it's almost 2 meters deep and very wide. And that's not normal either for this area or Illinois for a domestic or household building. All of these buildings are the last in a dense series of structures that are on the apex of the site, and they contain unusual fauna and fine lithics and ceramics, among other items, suggesting a late change in the use of the area, although an area that begins much earlier than the single date we have for the newly discovered East Village. Determining whether contemporaneous habitation occurs surrounding these special structures will help clarify how this part of the site was used. The very latest feature encountered on the apex of the site was a burial lying directly over the wall to the largest building. So you can see those yellow lines indicate where that wall was, whereas the yellow oval indicates where the burial was found. Generations old accounts of other burials encountered in the same area when the terrace was first farmed indicate a final use of the site may have been a cemetery, though the exact timing of that shift is also unknown. Identifying the extent of this or any other burial area will be important so that we can work with the landowner to manage the farming practices in a way that does not impact these ancestors. And this burial was left in place on site. These new data will help build interpretations of the social dynamics of this region in the understudied time period following Cahokia's decline, as will those from Kincaid and any additional sites we can explore as part of a regional research program. So let's very quickly talk about the decline of Greater Cahokia. And for that, I'll very briefly start at its beginning, just to put everything in context. The Mississippian period in Greater Cahokia begins at AD 1050 with a boom in the population thanks to an influx of people from across a very large geographic area, an extended period of ideal growing conditions, the site's geographic positioning, and a myriad of other factors. The American Bottom, which is the floodplain in which Cahokia is set, already had several large established communities during the preceding terminal woodland time period, but the scale and pace at which Greater Cahokia coalesced indicates a multi-ethnic society composed of people who came to participate in this newly founded city. That notion is supported by several other lines of data. Despite the multi-ethnic composition of Greater Cahokia, its material culture, or its artifacts, and community organization were remarkably uniform. The pots are all made in the same way, houses are built using a novel architectural technique, and the organization of village areas were planned ahead of time, which is remarkable considering the immigrants to this area arrived with very diverse traditions of potting, toolmaking, and even worldviews. This rapidly achieved uniformity attests to the intentional participation in and identification with this new society. Elsewhere in southern Illinois, very few and much smaller Mississippian sites are known, with Kincaid as the only notable exception. And even then, Kincaid was very small at its start and did not develop from a pre-existing late woodland village. I could go on about Mississippian life in Greater Cahokia at great length, but instead I will shamelessly refer you to this resource for more information so that I can move on to what's more relevant to today's discussion, which is Greater Cahokia's end. The final large-scale occupation of Greater Cahokia is referred to as the Moorhead Phase, and it begins around 1200 AD, 150 years after Cahokia's founding. This phase is recognized archaeologically through notable changes in the objects of everyday life, such as pottery and dwellings, and in the way that communities organize themselves, such as the household size and building proxemics. The shape of the most basic pottery form, the jar, changes from a compound and finely finished vessel to a simple globular form, typically of slightly greater volume per household than most of the jars found in other household contexts. The uniformity of Cahokia's material culture also changes, marking a generations-long shift to more localized expressions, which means that we're seeing more differences between the artifacts from site to site than we did in earlier times. Several researchers have attributed these changes to expanding social relationships, both with people from upper Mississippian groups to the north and with groups from far southern Illinois. These artifactual changes result in greater similarities between American Bottom and other Southern Illinois site material assemblages, which indicates more open social networks and greater autonomy throughout Greater Cahokia, resulting from a shift from central to local authority. While Cahokia's external exchange networks had always included exotic materials and trade goods from far away, the late Mississippian period includes pottery typical of much closer neighbors, whose material culture was not well represented in early Mississippian times, such as the two jars you see on the upper right of this slide. Those are typical Tennessee Cumberland style jars from Southern Illinois, but we see things that could easily be mistaken for those in Moorhead Phase sites in the American Bottom. The appearance of fluorite is also notable. This mineral is rarely seen during the early period in Greater Cahokia, despite its prized gem-like qualities, but it does appear more commonly during the Moorhead Phase. A large outcrop of this material is located along the Ohio River just east of Kincaid. We also see the appearance of formal hard-fired clay hearths interior to what are now larger, more square houses, and these are commonly seen in sites to the south as well. The example in the slide, the one on the left, is from the American Bottom. The one in the middle is from Kincaid, and the one you see on the far right is from Carbondale, which is approximately halfway in between. So these are sort of widespread during that era. So materials are now coming into Cahokia from the south that weren't there in great numbers before. But it's notable that materials from Cahokia were not going out during this time period or prior to it to those same places. So these seem to be newly formed relationships. For example, out of the tens of thousands of pottery sherds recovered at Kincaid, there are less than a handful that can be sourced to Cahokia, despite the fact that Cahokians were known to come from and go to places much more distant and difficult to access. Here's just a slide showing how Kincaid really is the closest very large mound center to Cahokia. But rather than say that Kincaid and Cahokia were unaware or uninvolved with another, because surely they were, my colleague Corin Purcell and I believe that Kincaid's people actively resisted Cahokian influence, choosing instead to look towards the Tennessee Cumberland and lower central Mississippi River valleys for trade and other partnerships. We interpret big changes at Kincaid following Cahokia's decline as a successful bid on the part of Kincaid's elite to establish a community as a leading center in a Mississippian landscape newly outside of Cahokia's shadow. By AD 1350, Greater Cahokia is nearly abandoned, which coincides with increasing complexity in Kincaid's layout and burial program and greater uniformity in the ceramics between the neighborhoods at the site. So while Cahokia was no more, Kincaid flourishes in a new way. There may even be former Cahokians resettling at Kincaid after its decline, as evidence of a late Mississippian enclave of people using a microblade technology native to earlier Cahokia suggests. And on the left, you can see microblades from Cahokia, on the right from Kincaid. This technology was used for bead making, which did occur at Kincaid prior to the arrival of this technology. Cahokia's rapid decline is also not seen throughout the rest of Southern Illinois. Instead, there is growth or establishment of additional sites and centers. Much more research is needed on the Mississippian period here to determine the presence and pin down the timing of the occupations in order to get a fuller picture of just what's happening. It's likely that some of the people leaving Cahokia rejoined their kin in distant lands, but others founded settlements in new locales nearby or joined pre-existing ones. Enterprising individuals or groups may have taken advantage of the absence of Cahokian influence to redefine their roles within their own communities, and previous buffer areas may have become attractive places for more southerly communities to exploit or occupy. Clearly, we need to do more archaeology to understand the post-Cahokian social landscape, and the perspectives of the indigenous descendants of the region's Mississippian populations will also enhance this research. But I hope this talk has served to illustrate the benefit of the juxtaposition of data-rich Cahokia and data-poor Southern Illinois, in that the former leads us in clear directions for planning future research, where the unanswered questions are many, and in how understanding more about what occurred immediately outside of Greater Cahokia leads to a richer interpretation of Cahokia itself. Thank you. Let me see if I can unshare my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamira. That was fantastic. So again, if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat. And we actually have a few, so I'm going to start off. So can the public visit any of these sites?
Yes, of course, Cahokia. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it has a wonderful museum. You can tour the grounds, go atop Monk's Mound, watch an excellent film about that. But also you can visit Kincaid. So Kincaid is in a pretty rural location, but thanks to the Kincaid Mound Support Organization, accessibility to that site is much greater now. It's on the Ohio Scenic River Byway, and there's a nice interpretive platform. And in the fall, they have Kincaid Days, where you can actually take the opportunity to go up on top of one of the largest mounds on site. And it's a beautiful site. I would really encourage people to go see it.
Excellent. Okay. Next question is the sinkhole at South Cape a threat to the archaeology?
It is. It's eating features right now. So it's very large, and while it's not growing rapidly, it is growing. For example, the first time I saw it, I looked around the edges and I didn't see any artifacts. And the next time I saw it a year later, I could see feature fill actively spilling into it. So Dr. Bankston and I are going to work on grants to do some salvage excavations around that portion of the site in order to mitigate that before it's lost.
Excellent. All right, here we go. Next one. How is Angel Mounds in Indiana related?
Well, they date to the same time period. So based on current dates, Angel starts either at the same time or slightly earlier, and they both ended about the same time. And they used to be called sister sites because they look very similar in their setup and layout, but there's probably a lot of differences between them, more so than we would call them, that I would call them sister sites anymore. They're far enough away that there was, I think, a buffer area between them. And you see more similarities in material culture between Kincaid and Angel than Kincaid and Cahokia, for example, especially in negative painted pottery. Aside from that, I think we need to keep exploring how they're different and the same. Surely they were part of the same large networks.
Excellent. Thanks, Tamira. Someone would like to know what the radiocarbon dates are for South Cape.
Almost all of them. So there's 5 from that terrace top area, and almost all of them are within, well, all of them are within 25 years of 1325. So 1300 to 1350 for the 5 that we have at the top. That eastern terrace area that we just recently got a date back, Dr. Bankston had a date run, gosh, probably 6 months ago. It's between 1400 and 1450. So that's could be up to a century later than the original area. So that puts the occupation much longer than we thought. We've yet to find any earlier dates, earlier than 1300, which doesn't mean they're not there. There's very deeply stratified features there and not a significant amount of excavation. We've kind of only scratched the surface. So I wouldn't be just surprised to find them earlier, but it's also possible that this was a very late founded village.
Excellent. Okay, South Cape is just north of Thebes Gap. Is this part of the reason the site is there? And then second question, and what might be the relationship between South Cape and Common Field?
I think that the location proximate to Thebes Gap and many other things is a very large reason of why South Cape is there. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, Thebes Gap has outcrops of orthocquartzite, which is a type of stone that was used for tools. And it's really pretty, in my opinion. It's silicified sandstone, so it has sort of a sugar-like appearance. And there's other resources too, but it's also at the border of several ecotones. So it's right on wetlands, it's right on forest, it's right on the river. It really is an advantageous position for a site. In addition to that, erosional remnant terrace, it's kind of an island when the river floods. So it would have been a great place to be as many sites were abandoned seasonally as they were flooded. South Cape remains above water a large part of the time. For the second part of that question, I'm going to ask Isabella to repeat it because I don't recall it, but I know there's a second part.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And what might the relationship be between South Cape and Common Field?
Oh, okay. South Cape and Common Field they are at the same time. So Common Field is halfway between South Cape and Cahokia, approximately. And it was a palisaded village, very large, with a large mound that was burned down in one episode. So probably attacked and burned down. And Megan Buchanan has done the most research there. And its ceramics, according to Megan, look kind of more similar to Cahokia than they do to areas south. So They may be related, they may not, they may just be two centers, one tying itself more closely to Cahokia, where Cape is tying itself more closely to Arkansas areas or the boot heel of Missouri. I think we need a little more research on both sides to kind of hash that out.
Excellent. All right. So it's interesting that Kincaid's connections are stronger to the southeast than to Cahokia. This recalls the southeastern connections that woodland groups of the lower Ohio and lower Wabash valleys had. So do you see Kincaid's population made mostly of descendants of local late woodland groups?
That's a really interesting question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. At Kincaid, you don't have a big resident late woodland population. Of all the excavation we've done there, we found one very late woodland feature. And in southern Illinois, in the Carbondale area to the north, you've got sort of different woodland expressions than at Kincaid. So in Carbondale, you have pottery that's almost identical to that at Kincaid during the early and middle woodland periods, but they've got different temper types. And you see that progression happening between groups in the Carbondale and Kincaid areas. But then it seems like people leave the Kincaid area. So I wouldn't say that the population is necessarily growing out of local groups, but it is possible that groups are coming down from the Carbondale area or up from the south to reoccupy Kincaid later.
Excellent. So I have a couple questions about the vacant corridor. So was the vacant corridor completely abandoned? And if so, where do you think Cahokians went during vacant corridor times?
No, it was not completely abandoned. There are still people living there, but the population density is remarkably low. And you no longer have large villages, Mississippian mound centers. So something big happened, and it happened pretty quickly, more quickly at Cahokia, where you see the decline happen. And then post Moorhead phase, the phase after that's called Sand Prairie, there still are people living there, but the sites are fewer, they're smaller. Whereas down in the Kincaid area, they persist until about 1450. Where did they go? Everywhere else. They went everywhere else. They probably went north, south, east, west. And that's why the descendants of the people of Cahokia or Kincaid are probably many groups of living people today. You couldn't just tie one indigenous group to any of those sites because they really did disperse to broad areas.
Excellent. So we have a couple questions about lunar alignments and celestial orientations. The first is, do you think that the architecture at South Cape has any celestial orientations?
I haven't looked into that. So my answer right now is I don't know. It's likely this happens at so many sites that it's likely, and there is definitely a set out orientation to all those structures. So they are aligning them to something important.
So then similarly, can you comment on the proposed lunar alignment of Kincaid and similarities to lunar alignments of Cahokia and other mound centers in the American bottom?
Well, I can't say that I'm familiar with which lunar alignment has been proposed for Kincaid or who's proposed it. So I can't really comment on that fully. That's my answer for that one.
Okay, great.
But if you had that question, email me and we'll talk about it.
I'm sure she will. Have you noticed the significant quality difference of work on projectile points of modern tribes in comparison to native peoples?
No, being a flint knapper is, a skill that just takes practice. So you can practice and get great at it today as much as you could before. I will say there is a lot more skill in the earlier time periods to Mississippian. So Mississippians use an expedient flake tool technology. And while they have some really beautiful lithic pieces, it's more common that most of their arrowheads or spear points are made off of flakes. And then, you go back into archaic time periods and you've got these very well crafted blades. So there is a difference between those time periods, just based on what they're doing. The bow and arrow changes things.
Excellent. You spoke of social networks across this region. Which artifacts do you think might be most useful for formally analyzing social relationships between sites and through time? And then there's a part 2 to that. Are there any types of material culture you find at these late sites that might be similar to artifacts in historical sites used by descendant communities?
As far as the first one goes, the social network question, I think ceramics, in part because they break. very easily, so they're replaced quickly. So we get a lot of them, and they're also very malleable, unlike stone tools, which have a finite amount of things you can do with them. You can do almost anything with ceramics. So when people are making these things, they're doing what they learned. So these are habitual practices. And a lot of times, the things you do that you don't even think about are the most revealing of your social networks. I sit and I make the pot the way my mother taught me to make the pot. So you can use not only that, but you can also use the actual clay itself. You can analyze the elements in the clay and say, oh, here I am at Cahokia, and I have something made out of clay from Arkansas, from Louisiana, from wherever. So those are really great. That requires sort of a library, an elemental library to do that analysis. But as more people are working on it, that's becoming a more and more realistic goal. So as far as social networks go, I'd say ceramics. Also looking at burial programs, because that's something that is sort of very tied to who you are. And in the Moorhead phase, in Cahokia at least, Chris Hedman and Tom Emerson have pointed out there's a diversity in the burial program that's probably cluing us into some differences in social ties. The second part of the question, which I believe was, do we see similarity between, was it ceramics of native potters and today and indigenous potters?
I'll reread it.
Okay.
Are there any types of material culture you find at these late sites that might be similar to artifacts and historical sites used by descendant communities?
Similar, yes, but the same, no. And largely because of this vacant quarter, people leave. So in the time that they leave, material culture is changing quite a bit. And then when we get to the historic period, there's an influx of European goods, and that really changes what indigenous peoples are doing during, pre-contact, contact, and historic times. They're using metal. They rapidly abandon their clay ceramic, their ceramics, things like that. So there's nothing I could say, oh, this person at Kincaid must be related to this person we see in this, the 1800s Illinois.
Excellent. And then lastly, where can we buy your book, Revealing Greater Cahokia?
Oh, well, I believe that ISAS, if you go to their Amazon store, I know that COVID has changed the flow of our goods outside of ISAS. So if you see that it's not available, that's why. But it's here, it's in the building, you can buy it. And Amazon stores where you can get, I believe, most of our publications.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Tamira, for a great talk. And thank you all for joining us this evening. If you want to watch any of our previous talks in this series, you can go to our YouTube channel. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and a fantastic rest of the day.
Thank you.